Well, as humanity moves far too slowly to stem the tide of climate chaos, new analysis has exposed holes in both European and French climate adaptation. A French public finance watchdog has published a new report, publishing that today, saying it regretted an absence of exhaustive and coherent budgeting of what that adaptation would require. We're going to talk more about that now with Antonia Kerrigan, who joins me on the set. Antonia, now, there have been two major reports this week, this French report as well as the EU report, both on climate adaptation and preparedness. What exactly does that mean?
Well, so when we talk about climate action, it's important to know that breaks out down into two major categories. You've got mitigation, that's the efforts we make to reduce our emissions, slow and prevent global warming. And then there's adaptation, and that is recognising that a certain amount of damage is done and that we need to now adapt our societies, our industries, our agriculture and our lifestyles to live with what has now become inevitable. And that includes protecting the economy, protecting quality of life, and also protecting things like public health. And it can be a range of actions. It can involve things like resourcing hospitals, better training health professionals to handle things like heat stress. It can also be things to do with urban planning. It can be not building our critical infrastructure on areas that are either floodable now or that could be floodable in 20 years. Also training more firefighters as wildfires ravage the forests across Europe, for instance, not just a European problem, also a global problem. Agriculture is a big one too. It's all about developing the future agriculture that has to be less water intensive, despite the temptation to irrigate more and more, of course, in these ever more frequent droughts. So yeah, adaptation is one of the two major axes of climate action.
Now, today there was this fairly damning report on where France stands on its climate adaptation measures. Tell us a bit more about France's specific issues.
Well, so France obviously faces a heightened flood risk in the north. The IPCC report of last year put the Hauts-de-France region in quite a scary territory, whereas in the rest of the country it's much more exposed to longer and ever-intensifying heat waves every summer. The verdict by the Cour des Comptes, this Auditor General, is that the evaluation of future and current adaptation costs is patchy, not to say inexistent, lacking sufficient data and sometimes even clear objectives. That's extremely damning. The kinds of things they point to specific actions that are needed and that they say haven't been fully accounted for in terms of future development on these issues. A need to, for instance, protect lives, livelihoods and quality of life through actions like upgrading homes. They say the vast majority of French homes are not suitable for France's future climate, with much more heat wave, much higher temperatures, especially for the elderly, for instance, who are at high risk of illnesses like heat stress. They also talk about upgrading energy infrastructure. France depends 63% on nuclear, which has its virtues, it's low carbon. However, a huge amount of cooling infrastructure is already needed and will certainly be needed in the future as the mean temperature rises and these extreme heat episodes also hit for longer periods every year. They also talk about upgrading the electrical grid, which is not set for the sort of climate of the 2020s, 2030s and 2040s. Then there's also agriculture. Now, agriculture is extremely strategic for food security. It's also extremely economically important in France. And it comes back to this idea that there is good and bad adaptation. The sort of emergency measure is lots of irrigation, the construction of mega basins, which are these artificial lakes that farmers can then draw on to water their crops in sort of drought emergency moments. But what we really need to be doing is developing better, more resilient crops and changing farming practices in a deeper way, this report says. One quite frightening statistic that's not new, but regarding coastal erosion. Now, 20% of France's coast is affected by coastal erosion, and the bill is absolutely whopping. So it was 14 million in 2021, 48 million in 2023, and according to this new report, it could be in the billions by 2050. That's huge amounts of money that the Cour des Comptes says the French government has not been planning for correctly. And then there's this instance where, of course, adaptation or the lack of adaptation is threatening mitigation, is going to make France, in short, a bigger net emitter of CO2 than it should be, and that's the threat posed to forests. Now, we depend on forests to act as carbon sinks, but they are absorbing less and less carbon. 58 million tonnes of CO2 in the French forests were absorbed in 2010. Only 30 million in 2021. So you can see a massive reduction in the efficacy of these carbon sinks. The government put 250 million euros on the table to restore 10% of the national forests. Of course, the Cour des Comptes says it's not enough as we face ever more fires, drought and plagues of insects.
Antonia